This is our first attempt at celebrating Juneteenth our way in Locksburg, Virginia. And as you know, Locksburg's history, this is our way of celebrating. So when you're looking for something, you get the best. I got the best speaker for us today that can document some stuff for us, okay? Because if you can imagine that in Galveston, Texas, if they didn't know about it in those days, even though we may have known about it, we probably didn't feel the effects of it. So this is the second Independence Day of America. Okay, July 4th is the first. So I just want to introduce you to Joe Thompson. He is I found a wealth of knowledge. I'll leave it at that. And he presents an excellent talk. So as people are coming and going, we will do what we do. All right? I'm Garfield Parker, Harold Blackwell. I shouldn't start that. Dave, Desiree, it's great to be Wayne, you know everybody here. Bernie, I haven't seen you in a while, so glad to see you. Okay? But I do want to introduce you to Joe Thompson. I consider a native of Northumberland, not a native of Northumberland County, but a native of Texas. And who is I'm here to stay. I'm here to stay in Northumberland, okay?
He's a come here?
No, he's no longer come here.
He's gonna stay here.
You can stay here. All right?
I'm not from here, but he's gonna stay here.
You stay here. Okay. I'd like to introduce you to Joe Thompson.
I'm old, so I sit down. These are things I'm going to refer to, and I'm going to leave them up because you can't read them. They're too small unless you get up close to them. I'll put this middle one up. I was going to do it standing. I'll put that middle one up. That's my great-grandmother. She was the first freed person in Texas after 1865. She was after 1861. She was actually born in 1861. So for my own personal family, she was a star.
And what's her name, Mr. Thompson?
Ann Evans.
Ann Evans.
Ann Evans. Actually, her mother was a slave named Marceline. And she took the name Roberts, which was her slave master's name. And, well, that's a long story. I'm still working on it. When I talked with Garfield, I said, Garfield, how long do I have? I have 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. He said, take 30 minutes. So you're going to get a 30-minute talk. And I'm going to start it right now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I'm Joe Thompson, a 30-year come here resident of Heathsville. I came here in 1995, built a home here. I plan to die here. And I'm also a native Texan. My family goes back in Texas 164 years, which was before and after Juneteenth. I'm going to give a 30-minute speech, and I'm going to cover, it's not really a speech, it's an education. It's going to cover 5 sections. I'm going to tell you share the history of Juneteenth and its relationship to Northumberland County. I'm going to cover first the Virginia soldiers, because they have a relationship to Northumberland County. Second, come on in.
No, that's all right. I'm
Second, I'm going to cover slavery before 1865, the day of June 19th, the reaction to freedom after June 19th, then the celebration of freedom, and then the legal aspects. And with that, when the president and the right one signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was in 1861, he included in there that there would be a military established at the same time. That was in 1861 when that was signed, the first one. The 25th Corps, XX5, the 25th Corps, which is a unit of the Army, was formed in Fredericksburg, Virginia on December the 3rd of 1864, right there in Fredericksburg. It included people from the surrounding area, Spotsylvania, Orange, Culpeper, including Northumberland County. All black, this unit. It was referred to as the United States Colored Corps, Colored Troop, 25th Corps. Now, what do we know about that group? Because these were your people. These were our people. The total unit was 13,600. It's a lot of volunteers. They were a part of the defeat of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. They were in the group. They were a part of the first soldiers who marched into Richmond on April the 3rd of 1865. These were your people. They left those successes and were destined to go, sent to Texas to be the army of occupation against Napoleon's troops who was fighting with the Mexicans along the Texas border around Brownsville, Texas. But God intervened. God had a plan that they were not aware of. So the seas became rocky and the storms wailed, and they ran out of food and rationings. And so they had to divert to Galveston Bay. So they were at Galveston Bay, arriving May the 24th through the 26th. That's just a little before June the 19th. So 10,000 black Virginian soldiers debarked in Galveston, Texas, at the end of May. You need to know a little bit about what Galveston's like. Galveston is 30 miles long by, at its widest, 6 miles wide. 6 times 30 is 180 square miles. Northumberland, right here, is 191 square miles. So Galveston is smaller than Northumberland. 10,000 black uniformed soldiers in Galveston. Still a slave-holding state, and slaves were still being sold on the block at the end of Galveston Street. Since those men had personally won the war against Robert E. Lee, they knew the war was over. They knew that those slaves in Texas were free. And while there was no order, you can imagine them moving all over the city and talking to people and spreading the news that they were free before Granger even gets there. Just by oral talk. So when Major Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, he had a total number of troops of 2,000. Part of them came in on the 18th. He didn't come in until the 19th. When they came in on the 18th, they set up a headquarters. He came in on the 19th, and then he brought in with him 2,000 troops. So now we have 10,000 plus 2,000. There are black soldiers and officers all over Austin. On June 19, when he arrived, he wrote this. It's all handwritten. We got this from the archives. This is actual. He wrote this order. This section right here covers exactly what's there so that you can read it easily. And the main part of this, I'm just going to read this section. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, this one, all slaves are free. So basically, it was not a new order. It was reinforcing and announcing to them that this order was there, and he was now, as the commanding officer with the soldiers, ready to enforce it. Now, and the people from Northumberland, as a part of the troops, were there. Now, before this, what was slavery like in Texas? The President Lincoln issued the proclamation on January the 1st of 1863. It was ignored by the Confederate States. In order for the proclamation to have any effect, it needed to be enforced by arms, through forces taking over Confederate territories. No soldiers, no freedom. As the Union Army advanced southward, our slaves slipped away and went to the Union headquarters. They were freed. That's how the people were free. When they ran to where the soldiers were, when the soldiers came in, then they were freed. Union soldiers began to move down as they won more battles. In the 2 years between 1863, which is when all this starts, and 1865, which is when this was signed, those 2.5 years, slave owners moved many of their slaves as they could from these areas, South Carolina, Arkansas, Louisiana, Virginia, down to Texas, because there were no troops in Texas. It was the furthest away from here. And so between 1863 and 1865, 250,000 slaves were in Texas on June 19th. So it's with that background that here we are, the arrival of Major General Gordon Granger. Major General has 2 bars.
Stars. 2 stars.
2 stars. When I was a federal person, I outranked 3 stars. I should know that. Although General Robert E. Lee had surrendered on April the 9th of 1863, the war had continued in many of the Confederate states. They didn't recognize the fact that Lee had lost and that his loss applied to the whole Confederacy. They just said it applies in Virginia, but it doesn't apply to us. The Mississippi Army of the Confederacy did not surrender until May and June of that year, just a month before he even arrived. And in Texas, they were still fighting. In fact, the Battle of Palomito Hill, which is on a beach down near Brownsville, Texas, was fought on May the 12th through the 13th. Palomito Hill had a black cavalry troop, U.S. colored troops stationed there. The Confederate had a colonel named John Rip Ford, who borrowed some cannons and artillery from the French that were there, attacked the colored troops with those artillery and killed all of them. So Texas had not only had not implemented the law, they were still fighting. These were the conditions that were going on. So here we are, June the 19th, 10,000 U.S. cavalry, U.S. colored troops, 2,000 Rangers. Finally, on June the 19th, Granger writes his order and issues it. And I read that portion. Now, what happened? Contrary to popular Juneteenth myth, there's no evidence that Granger called a public meeting. There's no evidence that he went into Austin Villa, which is often you find in some of the textbooks. And they say that he appeared on the villa, he spoke to the crowd. There was no crowd. He did not use Austin Villa. Austin Villa was a private residence. It's still there. And they tell you, you can take a tour, and they tell you that's where the proclamation was read. Not true. They're just making money on it. And the reason they're able to do that is because there was a Battle of Austin in 1862, 3 years before 65. And in that battle, the Confederates, the Union Army won, and they took over this private home, Austin Villa, as their headquarters. But later that year, the Confederacy came back and took it back again, so that it was back in Confederate hands on the at the end of 1863. So here we are 2 years later. So what they do in the tours is they conflate the two and say that that was happening in 65 when it didn't happen in 65, it happened in 62. Here is how, rather than, come on in, young folks, have a seat. Rather than have a large cheering audience and a crowd and giving a speech from the top, the order was handled to Granger's subordinate, F.W. Emory, who had it posted in newspapers and handbills. And then the army dispersed itself throughout Galveston to tell the news. They went handing out the handbills and reading it throughout Galveston. Here's what another fact you should know. 95% 95% of the slaves could not read or write. 95% could not read or write. They couldn't read the handbills. They couldn't read the newspaper. And we did not have news, and this was only in Galveston. The news is not being spread throughout Texas the way it is on the internet today. This was just at this moment here in Galveston. There are two major churches of African American descent in Galveston at the time. The oldest black church in Texas was in Galveston, and that church is Avenue L Baptist Church. And that church was started in 1848 by Thomas Borden. You know Borden milk, condensed milk, like, well, his son, after he left, was a member of this church, the Borden family. And it was after, later in life, about 10 years later, he moved to New York and he started the Borden Company. But at this time, in 1848, when they established this church, in 1848, slaves were a member of the church. Slaves were welcome into the church, so it was there. A lot of black people were in that church in 1865 when they were passing out the handbills and saying that you were free. The other church was the oldest Texas First AME church in Texas. It was also in Galveston, and they went there. So just as in here, most of the news to the African community came through the church. The people in the church received the information, received the handbills, and they spread it throughout the community. What was the reaction? Well, confusion, joy, pain. Slaves didn't know what to think of it. They didn't know what to believe of it. They were happy. They knew what it said. It's pain. The owners didn't know what was going to happen with the soldiers. They didn't know what was going to happen with their businesses. They were angry on the part of the owners. There was praise on the side of the slaves. Everything changed. Yet nothing changed. Because in that very instant, everyone was just getting the news together, and they were trying to figure out where they was going to go from there. It was just like when desegregation of the schools happened here. The law changed in '54, but it was a long time before you moved from Roseland School to the other schools. And this was the same thing in this case. The law had now been realized, but there was going to be a long time before everybody even gets the news. It will take a whole year for that news with the soldiers going out to get to all of Texas. It will take a whole year. But I'm only covering the period of that day right now. It was a new reality now, and they had to figure out on both sides how they were going to do it. There was no celebration. There was no celebration. People in the fields. There's no celebration. There were only 1,000 slaves in Galveston. Galveston was a slave port. That's where the ships came in with the slaves on it, and that's where many of them were sold. But the slaves were then dispersed out into the other portions of Texas. The largest number of slaves were sent to East Texas, where I'm from. East Texas, Lufkin, where I was born, reared, still on property. Crockett, St. Augustine, Houston. 80% of the slaves in Texas were in that area. Over 180,000 on June 19. They were there because that's where the cotton was being raised. There were cotton mills and cotton gins all over East Texas. And our people were picking it. Corn, just like the corn crops are here. That's where the mansions were for the white slave owners, because they were rich from this labor. Marshall, Texas, which is 40 miles from my hometown, and where Wiley College was initially founded, had the largest slave plantations on it. But there were many just like it. The biggest reaction on the part of the slaves was they wanted an education. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. They wanted to be able to read and write. They wanted an education. And now that they were free, they wanted to teach each other. Those who could read would teach, and those who needed to learn would learn. And they started small schools and homes. And just like here, 2 years before, they started schools like Holley and like Holley and Rosenwald. And that was what they wanted, so that they could progress in life, to get an education. Because young folks, if you don't have an education, you are just a slave to the people who can read and write and know what's going on. And that was the main thing that happened on June 19th that's not written about, but I know that you can understand exactly where they were, because that had happened here when the slaves in this portion of the country were freed earlier. Another thing that the masters did in reaction, those large plantations that had shipped slaves from the north during the buildup of the war, from these areas to Texas, now shipped many of them to Cuba. Many of the slaves who came out of Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, once the soldiers arrived on June 19th, they were shipping them to Cuba. Cuba wouldn't cancel slavery until 20 years later, in 1888. And not only Cuba, but other countries in South America. So some of the people from here went to Texas, were slaves to Texas, and then moved to Cuba, and then moved to further south, wherever they could buy the land and move the slaves. You won't read that in most of your textbooks. Many of the slave owners did not inform the slaves that they were free. They couldn't read. Many of them, this was June, just like here. Corn is coming. Cotton was blowing. They didn't tell them until after the crops were in. And some of them didn't tell them until the second crop was done. The only time they told them was when the army arrived, went into that town or that locale or that farm. And then they could learn. Yet, a greater realignment did take place. Between June 19th of 1865 and 6 months later, that December, most of the slaves had moved. They had left the farms just like they did that very first day in Galveston. They left there going to find their relatives in Oklahoma, Virginia, wherever. They just left. Some left on feet, some left on horseback, some left on wagons, but they left. And sometimes they were just going down the road in groups, singing, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home," all singing, just like we do today. Singing the song, "Oh freedom, oh freedom, I've got freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, I've got freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord." It's a long walk from Texas to Virginia. It's a long walk from Texas to Arkansas. It's a long walk when you don't have anything but the clothes on your back. You don't know where you're going to eat, where you're going to sleep. And there were instances where slave owners let their dogs loose on them as they were moving in various places. Their bloodhounds attacked. During the period, 2,500 fleeing slaves were shot and killed. It's a record. You can find that in the literature. So of 250,000 who were in Texas, 2,500 were killed by shots as they tried to escape. That's 1%. It's a high rate of murder. Jubilee and June 19th had real repercussions and real hopes, but it came with a lot of blood and a lot of toil. But we were, in the end, freed, singing, jubilant, happy. That's why we celebrate this day. We know that we all need to know the consequences of why we celebrate, because we don't have to endure that anymore. But they didn't celebrate then. It was June the 1st of 1866, 1 year later, that the celebrations began. The people had moved to different statuses. They were now in a position to celebrate. They were no longer under the master's control. In Houston, Texas, For example, there's a preacher named Jack Yates who had been a slave himself, but in 1866 was now the minister of a large church in Houston. He collected he and the church collected $10,000 and bought a parcel of land in Houston to celebrate that holiday and named it Emancipation Park. Emancipation Park we have been celebrating Juneteenth there from 1866 until 2024, every single year. 1826 to 2024. And you go there now on Juneteenth, and it's a doozy. It's a big celebration. I did it as a boy, but not only in Houston, but those kind of land purchases were in the major cities in Texas: Austin, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Dallas. And so in the early period after June 19th, those celebrations continued. And as people migrated from Texas out to other places, like Virginia, Heathville, or California, or New York, we took with us our celebration of June 19th. And over time, it's taken 164 years, but over time we began to move out and involve those celebrations every place. And that's how the celebration has spread. But it also spread by law. In 1979, Al Edwards, who graduated from Texas Southern University in Houston, a historically black school. For you young folks, that's an HBCU. That's a small black school that specializes in assisting black people in learning and education of the highest quality. He graduated from Texas Southern. His father was a minister in Houston. He became a congressman. And on June the 19th, he put in a bill making Juneteenth in Texas a state holiday. Didn't pass the first time, but by 1980, 1 year later, Texas became the first state to recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. And from that date, 1979, until 2021, other states began to make it a state holiday. Until in June on 2021, 4 years ago, what's the date, 23rd, 3 years ago, an old lady from Fort Worth, you'll see this on current television, walked from Fort Worth to Washington trying to encourage the administration to make it a federal holiday.
What was her name?
Her first name was Oprah. I can't think of her last name, but you can Google it. And she received the Medal of Honor as a result of that. But she was just a symbol of all the hundreds of other people who had made the struggle. I'm just giving you a glimpse of an overview of those who fought for this cause. North Dakota and South Dakota, two of the last ones to sign in as a state. You can go back and look at the whole list. But in 2021, President Biden signed it. And right here in Northumberland, at the Tavern Square, many of you participated in the first one when it was a national holiday here in Northumberland. And just like all the other celebrations, they are the same. Barbecue, French fries, fish fries, singing, dancing, moving, speechifying. We have a great time. And thank you, Northumberland. Thank you, Holley, for being the real participants and for carrying on this tradition. And with that, I'm finished.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.